Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 230 of Humanity Rising. As we begin our program today, I think it's important that we all just note that as we speak right now, live, the jury in Minneapolis at the trial of Derek Chauvin, who was on trial for manslaughter of various degrees for the death of George Floyd on May 25th of last year, begins its deliberations. There have been several weeks of testimony from the prosecution, from the defense, and yesterday they had closing statements and the jury began its deliberations. Probably no other event in 2020 so galvanized world attention as the 9 minutes and 24-second witness through YouTube, filmed by a 17-year-old Black girl who was just passing by and filmed Derek Chauvin's knee on the neck of George Floyd till he was dead. And he kept his knee on that neck for a full 3 minutes after George Floyd was dead. The jury is deliberating. So I'd like us all to begin this program in solidarity and support that the jury, with all the turbulence in the world news, it comes down to 12 men and women on a jury, the foundation of democracy, to discern and adjudicate justice. So let us just pause and take a few deep breaths, center ourselves in our bodies, close our eyes, and place our attention on our heart. Listen for just a minute to our heartbeat in a spirit of deep gratitude and thanksgiving that we're alive. We're all alive together at this extraordinary moment in the human journey. Thank you, everyone. And now, with a heart full of gratitude and a heart full of thanksgiving for each and every one of you who are joining our session today, I want to begin by noting that the killing of George Floyd provided an iconic image of domination. The domination of patriarchy, the domination of racism, white supremacy, the domination of legal structures that coerce the vulnerable, the domination of power over compassion. In many ways, the pandemic emanating from nature is a challenge as never before of a culture of domination that has gone back thousands of years and from which the world is only beginning to extricate itself. I think the little virus stopped our world for many reasons, but a fundamental reason was to give us pause long enough to reflect on who we are in relationship to our past and who we are in relationship to the future that we want to build together. That's why Humanity Rising is here. How does humanity at this moment want to rise? Well, one of the most fundamental things I would say is we want to rise from domination to partnership. We want to implement processes that can enable us, that can empower us to make this transition. So today, synchronistically, at this moment, when the jury is deliberating, we want to contemplate how to move from a domination culture to a culture of partnership and explore how to do that. And we're very privileged and in fact honored to bring together two public intellectuals that have been influential, I would say, at a global level over the past decades. We want to bring in Riane Eisler, who wrote the seminal book back in the 1970s around the Chalice and the Blade, and has since then written a number of books, The Wealth of Nations, and most recently, Nurturing a New World, which really looks at how the brain is shaped by both domination and partnership. She's the founder of the Center for Partnership Studies. We also want to welcome Joe Jaworski, who also wrote a critically acclaimed international bestseller back around the same time called Synchronicity, that really challenged people to look at a completely new way of understanding how human beings presence themselves and interconnect with not only each other, but the larger ecosystem of cosmic interconnectivity. And then went on to be the co-founder of the U process, which is arguably the most effective change process developed in our generation. He's the chairman of Generon. He's written also a number of books, Presence, and most recently Source. And between these two individuals, we have an extraordinary synchronicity between understanding the dominator world out of which we're coming and the partnership world into which we all know we need to go. And a process, the U process, the U theory, that has over decades now refined itself into an instrument of social and personal and collective change, I would say without peer. And so, Riane, Joe, we want to welcome you, and we're going to shape this conversation in the following way. First, we're going to have Riane take about 10 minutes or so just to describe the partnership model and the issues that she's grappling with. And then Joe is going to take about 10 minutes to describe the U process as an instrument of social change. And then we're going to have a dialogue between the two of them for the next 30, 40 minutes or so. And then we're going to bring in three people who are intimately familiar with both the U process and moving toward a partnership, egalitarian, democratic, compassionate way of being and presencing ourselves to each other and in the larger world. And all the time that we're going to have this discussion, the jury is deliberating. And so let us presence this discussion, not only amongst ourselves, but in the hearts and minds of the jury. Because in some deep and very profound way, justice, compassionate justice, needs to be articulated and announced in that trial to enable all of us to engage in the cathartic process of moving from domination to partnership. So thank you all. Riane, I turn the program over to you.
Well, thank you, Jim. And I want to thank you all for being with us today. And it's a pleasure for me to just be with you for this brief time. To put it in 10 minutes is going to be a little bit challenging, but I'm going to do my best. I'll probably be somewhat nonlinear. Jim has already really explained that what my work has introduced, and those of you familiar with the Chalice and the Blade, which, by the way, came out in '87 and is now in its 57th US printing, you know that it introduced a whole new way, a whole new paradigm for looking at our past, our present, and the possibilities for our future. What I've called the domination system and the partnership system, or rather the partnership domination social scale. And as Einstein said, we really cannot solve problems with the same thinking that created them. So I'm going to invite you to leave behind the way that we've been taught to think of social systems, of our relations with one another, with nature, and with ourselves. Right, left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, Northern, Southern, for very two simple reasons that I'll just briefly state. My research was, well, it's deeply rooted, and I'll tell you a little about myself, in my early life, in being a refugee child from the Nazis, from Europe, from the Holocaust with my parents. And the question for me, starting very early after the trauma of those experiences, and also growing up in the industrial slums in Havana, we miraculously escaped the Holocaust, of course, but it was a difficult time for me as a child. And I couldn't understand why people are so cruel, why people were so violent. I mean, I witnessed my father being dragged off and my mother, thank goodness, getting him back on Christo night, so-called, because of all the glass that was shattered in Jewish homes and synagogues and businesses. The question for me was, well, is there a better way? And years later, I tried to answer this question, and I immediately could see that I couldn't answer it through the lenses of our conventional categories, right, left, religious, secular, etc., Because if you think about it, there have been oppressive, repressive, violent, unjust societies in every one of these categories. But also there's another deeper reason that required a whole new approach, and that really requires us to think about society in a much more holistic way and change our consciousness. That's the first step. Because if you think about it, like most studies of society and like these categories, they absolutely are incomplete. They ignore or marginalize nothing less than the majority of humanity, women and children. And with this, ignore findings from neuroscience, nothing less than neuroscience, that the first years of a child's life, our brains develop in interaction with our environments, which are cultural. So I came up after years of multidisciplinary, cross-cultural, and historical study, seeing patterns that are invisible, looking at a smaller picture that doesn't include the whole of humanity, doesn't include where we all live in our family and other intimate relations, and yes, fails to include that long period of time called prehistory, millions of years. And I saw these configurations. On the one side, whether I'll talk about contemporary societies, whether it's Hitler's Germany or Stalin's Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, rightist, leftist, secular ones, or Khomeini's Iran, or the Taliban, or ISIS, or the rightist fundamentalist alliance, Eastern and Western religious societies, they all have the following configuration in common. One authoritarian top-down rule in both the family, because this, if we really want to change things, we have to start with what I've called 4 cornerstones, and the first one is childhood. We have to start there. And all institutions in between. The second cornerstone is again something that we've been taught to ignore: the construction of gender roles and relations. It is not coincidental that as we're trying to move towards partnership, we're hearing much, much more about, quote, traditional, which are not traditional, by the way, because we've told false stories, gender stereotypes of masculinity and femininity, because that is fundamental. Because as in domination systems, not only do you have these rigid gender stereotypes in the ranking of male and masculine over feminine and female, but you also have a gendered system of values, which informs our thinking, our economics, so there's always money for prisons, the punitive male head of household, or for weapons and wars, the hero as warrior, as killer. But somehow there isn't enough money for caring for people, for caring to keep a clean and healthy environment. And this is built into both capitalist and socialist economic theory, okay? So that when Smith and Marx wrote, they saw nature as just there to be exploited, nothing about caring for our natural life support systems. And as for the work of caring for people, starting in early childhood, for them, that was just women's work to be performed for free by a woman in a male-controlled household. The third part is built-in abuse and violence, which you have to maintain what I call hierarchies of domination. Rather, because we need parents, we need teachers, we need managers, we need leaders, rather than hierarchies of actualization. We need new language. And that takes me to the fourth difference, which is story. And we have, whether it's original sin or selfish genes, it's the same story. We're bad we have to be controlled rigidly from the top. Uh, that is what we're trying to leave behind. If you move towards the partnership side, first of all, you see that we've been told a false story. For millions of years, when we humans lived as foragers, our societies oriented more to the partnership side. They were more egalitarian, more gender balanced, and yes, they were less violent. We know now from archaeology, from linguistics, from even DNA studies, that war is at most 5 to 10,000 years old, which is a drop in the evolutionary bucket. But it isn't just that. If we fast forward, uh, for the last 300 years, during another period of great disequilibrium, when the Industrial Revolution heated up, we have seen one movement after another challenging traditions of domination. They've all challenged the same thing, whether it was the challenge to the so-called divinely ordained right of kings to rule, or of the so-called divinely ordained right of men to rule over women and children, or the so-called divinely ordained right of a, quote, superior race to rule over, quote, an inferior one, all the way to the environmental movement, challenging our once hallowed conquest and domination of nature that at our level of technology could take us to an evolutionary dead end. So we see that societies that have moved more to the partnership side rank highest in the World Happiness Reports. Finland, for the fourth year in a row, has been number one in the World Happiness Reports. Very strange, because Finland is a very dark place, you know, and we associate that with depression, but it ranks high in happiness. Why? Because it orients more to the partnership configuration. First of all, in both the family and the state, there is more democracy, real democracy, more egalitarianism. And children are not child rearing. Well, they, like other Northern European nations, pioneered laws saying it's against the law to physically punish children as a form of discipline, which is a very important partnership trend. Secondly, they have much more gender balance in both the family and the state. Think about it for a moment. Women, as heads of state in Finland, it's a commonplace there. Women are very represented, almost half of the parliament, of the national government. And as the status of women rises, this is where this gendered system of values that both capitalism and socialism and GDP and even our economic schools still perpetuate to devalue this women's work of caring and caregiving, right? The caring for people. No, they have caring policies and they are not socialists. They have a very healthy business sector precisely because they invested in their human infrastructure, in universal health care, very good quality, highly paid and trained child care and early childhood education, generous paid parental leave. You can see how the pattern goes. And so it is up to us, and I really am going to wind down because I don't want to take so much time, to change our consciousness, to wake up from what I've called the domination trance. Because as long as we have this fragmented consciousness, you know, a colleague of mine calls our conventional categories, right, left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, and so on, as weapons of mass distraction because they fragment our consciousness. So I invite you to really think in these terms, and then a lot of things that seem random and disconnected fall into place. And I want to close on that because if you really think about the last 300 years, sometimes I say it as a joke that when I get really depressed, I think of the European Middle Ages. Why? Because they oriented so much more to the domination side, the Inquisition, the Crusades, the witch burnings. But if you think of the movements that took us out of there, they focused primarily on dismantling the top of the domination pyramid, politics and economics as conventionally defined. They left in place these four cornerstones that really we have to pay much more attention to. Childhood because of neuroscience, gender because of what I just very quickly went over, economics, but moving to a caring economics of partnerism where we invest in our human infrastructure and in our natural infrastructure. And thank goodness that's beginning to happen even here with President Biden talking about investing in our human infrastructure. And yes, changing our story, changing our language. So I thank you, and I turn it back to our friend Jim.
Thank you, Riane. The dominator trance is a very good way to describe. We're all like in a dream state. It's like we're sleepwalking and slowly waking up. So thank you for that very splendid and very concise description of some of the challenges and some of the models that we have to guide us on our way. So Joe, I'll turn the podium over to you now for a similar descriptive of the U process.
Good. Thank you so much, Jim. And Riane, thank you for that splendid opening. That really draws me in and sets the stage for a great dialogue. Just let me begin. I'm going to spend 10 minutes or so to draw you a picture of the U process, which Jim has described as an instrument of social change, which is an accurate description. It's a process, it's a methodology for acquiring knowledge and for solving the world's most pressing issues, the most complex problems. Some people have begun calling this a wisdom practice and feeling that it's a core competency for organizations of all stripes to begin to embrace, whether it be government or NGOs or business. So with that, let me first just describe what the U is in terms of something that you could draw on a piece of paper right now. It's very simple. Just draw a U, and on the left-hand side, write the words observe, and then underneath that observe and observe 3 times. And the reason we say that 3 times is that this is critical. This is about observing current reality. And if you get that wrong, if you don't understand the current reality in which the system is operating, then it's not going to work. So it's critically important. The bottom of the U is you could imagine or write the words, go to that deeper place of knowing. Go to that deeper place of knowing. Now, I'm going to explain momentarily what that is, but it's the most it's the deepest element of this process, and it's where the magic occurs. And on the right-hand side, it's act in an instant. So the point is that once you gain this knowledge, you must act in that cubic centimeter of chance that is presented. Now, one way to understand the U process is to understand what it feels like when you're operating and acquiring knowledge at the bottom of the U. And one way I can describe this is to tell you about a story when I was 18 years old and an undergraduate student at Baylor University when an F5 tornado came through town 2 blocks from my apartment. That's the largest tornado that's ever hit Texas, and it utterly destroyed downtown Waco. I made my way over there. We formed a team of 6 people. I was maybe the 3rd person on the scene. And we worked for 18 hours, pulled out 29 people without stopping working for those 18 hours. And here's the way it felt like. We were hyper aware. It was like an acute awareness. Your actions were spontaneous. It was as if you were acting without a sense of me doing it. It was a sense of being used as an instrument. There was high coherence between the 6 of us. It was a single intelligence. We were like a flock of birds. And the thing is, we were not communicating with one another verbally. We were just deeply connected. And the most important element of this is that I was acquiring knowledge on a consistent basis that was impeccably correct. I knew exactly where to go to find the next person. And the way to summarize this is that the whole capacity that we all experienced was shockingly effective. So that's what operating in the U process as an individual or as a team feels like. Now, it's instructive to know the origin of this. This process, we were charged with the responsibility by a very large organization of Shell Oil Company, Saudi Aramco, and Texaco to discover the source of the entrepreneurial impulse. That was our responsibility, because this organization needed to become, as they said, from operating like elephants. They were all raised in old oil companies to operate like their competition, which were operating like gazelles, all entrepreneurs. That's what we went to discover. And in the process, we were presented by a person that we came across in this journey named Brian Arthur, who was a tenured professor at Stanford at the age of 29. And he's the one that gave us those 3 coordinates. And then my colleague, Otto Scharmer, and I developed this in a more complete a model with it being 1 process, 7 practices, which we could talk about later. But at the bottom of the U, I mentioned, is where the magic occurs. And this is the question that would arise in your mind: where does this knowledge come from? And there are 12 or so names that scientists of all stripes call this. One of the persons that we met in this journey was named Eleanor Roche. And Eleanor is a noted cognitive scientist at Berkeley. And she's the one that introduced to me the name source. And she said that it's the most descriptive name she knows for it. And that was reinforced by the Dean of Engineering at Princeton. There are named scientists refer to this as the implicate order, as the field, as the Akashic field, as the Tao. The fact is, it's ineffable, and if you try to describe it too particularly, you're leading people astray. We can talk more about that. But the final thing I want to say is that this process operates at any scale. It can operate like the team I described. It can operate individually if you're on a search to discover the solution to an intractable problem. Or it can work at the societal scale, which is what's so relevant in today's dialogue. And later I can tell you give you some illustrations of how this was utilized on issues and problems that were of societal scale. Jim, let me turn it back over to you.
Well, I appreciate your comments, Joe and Riane. And now we have a basis upon which we can proceed. I think that Riane has really profoundly articulated sort of the what of what we're dealing with as the world confronts these structures of both mind and culture and law and tradition that have kept human beings in a coercive system. And Joe has very skillfully described a process through which fundamental change is transacted toward a more illuminated and compassionate, self-aware outcome. And I think the dialogue that we've been having between Joe and Riane, which we are deeply engaged in, and may end up having an international forum and symposium just on this topic, is basically, if I could put it the most simply, is how do we use the U process to engage in cultural, societal transformation at a global level? Because the whole globe is in that dominator model. And just like there are a few examples of successes at societal level in the U process, there's a few examples of some corporations, some cities, some countries that are beginning to engage in partnership and more egalitarian processes. And so part of what we want to explore is, how do you scale this? How do you do this at a level that can catalyze a change of consciousness at a mass and global level? So I think I would like to start with you, Joe, and have you talk a little bit more about when the U process has been successful at a societal mass level. And then Riane, just to have your comment, and we'll lead the discussion from there. But that's what we're looking for, folks, is how do we come up with a capacity, an instrument of globally scalable transformation that goes to the heart of the human predicament, which is what Riane is describing. So Joe, you first, give us some examples.
Good. Let me begin with two examples, and if you want to go a little deeper, please let me know. The first one that I would mention, Jim, is called the Sustainable Food Lab. This was a U-process laboratory that was designed to shift the food supply chain system between Europe, between the United States, and between South America. So all three of those continents were involved. Although I didn't know it before this began, at the time this lab started, it was known that the food supply chain globally, of course, including those three areas, was broken, severely broken, and it was a race to the bottom. The small coffee growers were being abused, and the very large producers and distributors were taking it all, but they were operating highly inefficiently. We brought together 40 companies representing a microcosm of that system, and went through a 6-month workshop, a lab that in fact Susan Taylor helped lead, and that resulted in, over a 3-year period, 120 projects that were hugely effective in shifting this entire system. We started, as I mentioned, with 40 players representing a microcosm. It now has almost 150 companies, from the small growers to the large players like Unilever. And that was such an important process and undertaking that Peter Senge, the noted organizational development expert at MIT, devoted an entire appendix to his latest edition of the 5th discipline. So that's one example. Another one was the U process was used to help severely reduce child malnutrition in the state of Maharashtra in India. This was a project that was instituted by a man named Tex Gunning, who was head of Unilever's subsidiary there in India. And this project took about 5 years to accomplish. But the key players to starting this were Unilever, a NGO called Synergos, which is headed by Peggy Delaney, David Rockefeller's daughter, and Oxfam, the well-known NGO, and we brought in the government of the state of Maharashtra and the prime minister of the country, Those people were present in the room all the way down to the mother who was breastfeeding her baby. So every element of the system was in the room. Again, I don't have the statistics at hand. Susan may know them, but it was hugely effective in significantly reducing child malnutrition in that state. And of course, it's still operating now. So Jim, those are two examples of the use of the U process at that scale.
Beautiful. I mean, those are important models, because if we're going to talk in any kind of realistic way, you have to have models that actually are demonstrated to work at the level that you're trying to deal with the problem. And in that regard,
Yes.
Riane, as you look at the kind of the four pillars, childhood, gender, economics, and narrative language, how intuitively, where would you start? And how would you start to kind of tackle, if you had the wherewithal, would you start with childhood first? Would you, dealing with all four areas all at the same time might be too massive, because it's always best to start small. But given what you know, where would you start a transformational process like the U process and the shift from domination to partnership?
I would start with economics, because these four cornerstones that we have to shift from domination to partnership are all inextricably interconnected. So if you look at our economic system, first of all, it's ancient. It came out of early industrial times, 1700s, 1800s. Will be antiquated on that count alone in the 21st century post-industrial era. But as I said, it also came out of more rigid domination times, and therefore incorporated and perpetuated certain basic cultural assumptions and a lack of consciousness of the economic value of the work of caring for people starting at birth, which neuroscience now shows. I mean, my most recent book, as you know, and as you mentioned, is Nurturing Our Humanity, which came out with Oxford University Press a little bit over a year ago, full of studies from neuroscience showing the importance of caring for children. But what we call education has been really indoctrination. As I said, in our economic schools, we're still carrying this distinction that both Marx and Smith made, and that relegating the three life-sustaining sectors, the natural economy, the volunteer community economy, and the household economy, to the work done there to just reproductive rather than productive. So I would start with a caring economics of partnerism, making the point that economics don't just appear, out of nothing. Like families, like religion, like education, they are embedded in a larger culture and are very different, depending on the degree of orientation of that culture or subculture to either the partnership or domination side, which would then bring in the other three cornerstones. But when I read Joe's book, I realized that I actually, in doing this research, of course, it's based on a lot of empirical studies, but the basic insights were really intuitive. And I wouldn't have called it the U process, but I remember distinctly one time, and I want to say that I was up, my office used to be upstairs in the attic. And when the children were still at home. And I was looking for a certain information, and I reached for a book and I turned it to a certain page, and there it was. And it was stunning. It was really stunning to me. And that is the U process. It was there, is all I can say. But I had to already, now this is the difference. I had to already have this frame, this awareness that there was something really wrong, and diagnosing what was wrong, that we've been told the wrong stories, that the evidence is there that we've been told the wrong stories, that we've been analyzing sociology, economics, political science, a completely incomplete picture that not only leaves out the majority of humanity, but where we all live, our family and other intimate relations, and how those shape nothing less than how our brains develop, and therefore how we feel, how we act, how we vote. I mean, in Nurturing Our Humanity, I write a great deal about why did people vote for Trump? You know, and the answers are there, but you have to have this frame.
It's synchronistic, that you point to economics as the potential gateway, and the two examples that you offered, Joe, are fundamentally about economics. But given the fact that you gave that example of going up to your attic and finding just the right book and turning it to just the right page, Joe, I think we would all benefit from just a few minutes on synchronicity, because that's, I think, Riane is absolutely correct. It is only synchronicity that is going to provide the key. It's not going to come through human will trying to make something happen, because when it rises through the U process, synchronicity is what governs. So just take a moment to tell us about synchronicity, and then we'll bring a couple of the other folks in to make some comments.
Okay, good. So Riane and Jim, this is absolutely correct. There's a principle that at the bottom of the U, where you're tapping into source, if you and the team or an individual is living and working in source, your life becomes more synchronous. And the whole book that I wrote before the U process, the book called Synchronicity, describes the cornerstones of that way of operating. And I would say the key principle, and this is what Riane was really experiencing. The first thing is that if you are deeply committed to what you're undertaking, deeply committed, without wavering, that is the gateway to synchronicity. So when you are committed, and also when you see the world as the way it really is, which is interconnected and is full of possibility, because the great physicist described the way the universe is constructed is one of infinite possibility. It's a worldview issue, and once you hold the worldview and are deeply committed, this is when, as the philosophers have said, that's when the supernatural assisting force shows up. Now, this may sound, somewhat as a fantasy, but it is the way the world operates. I'll leave it there, but ask me some questions, Jim, if you want, or Riane, if you would like to continue.
Well, I would like to ask you how, I mean, because I was deeply committed, am deeply committed and passionate about this, but I had also
Yes.
by that point, I knew what I was looking for because I had this larger frame of what really how social systems actually operate, that they're interactive, that they're mutually supporting components. I was using a methodology I called the study of relational dynamics, which not only look at what kinds of relations, to ourselves, to others, to nature, does a particular culture or subculture support, but what are the primary relations between the primary components of a social system. And that required identifying primary components that have been left out. And so my question to you is, how do we help people providing this frame, helping them see really that we've been, as somebody wrote in the chat, indoctrinated. I mean, if you look at Western science, for example, David Noble wrote a book called The World Without Women, pointing out that 600-700 years ago, Western science came out of a celibate, really clerical, misogynist world without women. That's what he called his book, A World Without Women. And I would say it was also a world without children. And if you now go to our time, it is only 50 years ago that we even began to have gender studies, women's studies, men's studies, even though socialization starts with gender roles in domination systems. Okay? I mean, you're a girl, you're a boy, you're feminine, you're masculine. And if you deviate as a man, you're a sissy, you're a wimp, and if you deviate as a woman, you're a bitch, a ball breaker. Whereas that very quality of assertiveness is valued in men, etc. So how do we help people have this frame and then go in and, as Jim said, really scale this? Because the examples that you gave were all within domination economics, trying to move more to the partnership side within a system that is not designed to move to that side. So, you're always sort of trying to put on an add-on here and an add-on there, and then comes a regime that completely takes off all the add-ons, right? And you have to start again, another regression. How do you do this with using the U process? Because that, I think, is the most important question for our future.
So the gateway may be through economics, as you said, but one way to think about this would be to convene a U process leadership lab with the 30 or 40 members representing the entire system that we seek to shift. And the operative question would be, what is the best gateway? What is the best gateway for us to shift the global belief system the way that it needs to be shifted? This is nothing short of and you alluded to this, Jim, of shifting the global belief system. And so this is just one idea of convening a lab to determine the best entry point or entry points, and the result would be 1 or 5 or 3 ways to begin to create this kind of change.
Well, I believe in human creativity. And also, as you know, we have developed some tools already, like the Caring and Connected Parenting Guide, like the
Yes.
Social Wealth Index, showing the economic value of caring for people and nature, being now consolidated into an index. Uh, but I worry that people are so embedded in the system that unless we
Yes.
have this larger frame, they're not going to, they'll still continue working with the existing reward system and which maintains the system, the domination elements.
Yes. Well, at the heart of the U process, when people gather to resolve this complex issue, they engage in dialogue. And one of the principles of dialogue, and this is Bohemian dialogue we're talking about, one of the principles of Bohemian dialogue is that people learn to suspend their current worldview. We're not asking people to give it up, because that's a losing game most of the time. What you do is encourage the people, and over 20 years we've seen the effectiveness of this, where we ask people just to suspend it, as Bohm described it. Susan's an expert at this, but to just hold it out there and release it, let it go for this particular dialogue, and let it exist, but suspend it. Now, for decades, for 2 decades now, we've been able to see people effectively do this, and that's why I believe that a U process lab incorporating Bohemian dialogue this way is a way to begin to affect this kind of global change.
I think this would be a good point to bring Susan in. Susan
Yes.
Taylor has been a partner of Joe's for many years. She's the CEO of Generon International. She's been working with David Baum's dialogue process very effectively in her transformational consulting process. So Susan would like to introduce you. And while I'm at it, I'd also like to introduce Hede van de Pol, who's also been working with Generon as a consultant in Europe in transformational processes, very successfully leading individuals, leading companies through a process of observation, breakthrough, and change of consciousness at the other side. Then finally, Leslie Southwick Trask, a cultural anthropologist, deeply immersed in the U process, who's worked with over 500 corporations in various countries around the world, again, very successfully around this issue that we're trying to get our minds around and probing. How do you catalyze a transformational process that changes consciousness, that changes the story, and in changes the story, empowers people to change economics, gender relations, treatment of children, and thus usher in a new world? So Susan, why don't you start and make some comments, and then Hede, and then Leslie, and then we'll get Riane and Joe to circle back into the conversation. Susan.
Great. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Riane. Thank you, Joseph. I've been listening intently, and it's not lost on me, Jim, what you said in your opening remarks about this most important day here with regard to the deliberation and also the pandemic. You know, there was something that you shared with regard to this virus and how this virus stopped our world. So all of this is not lost on me as I've been listening, because I think in particular what this pandemic has to offer us as a global society is an opportunity to do what Joseph was really just speaking about. And that is to listen with our eyes. When I think about how we're all out there, the majority of us who choose to, wearing masks where the mouth is covered, linking that to Joseph's story about Waco and how that team that was able to sense in and save victims, right? We're not communicating verbally. So when we have the mask covering, it's interesting to me that we see the eyes and we have the ears. And so linking, Joseph, to what you were just talking about with the underpinnings, Riane, of what you were sharing about the 4 cornerstones, I think this is really an opportunity to, yes, wake up and speak up, speak out, as we always have done, but from a different place. And that is the place of listening. That is the place of holding, as Joseph was saying, suspending our different views as a way not to defend them, because that's what causes divide, but in a way that instead allows us to hold all these differences, all these unique things that we have as human beings, just holding them, not agreeing, not accepting, just holding them, holding the fact that we have differences and how that can create harmony. Because defending, meaning that I'm right and you're wrong, that's the domination piece, right? But linking to Riane, your model, the partnership piece is when we can come together in a way that we understand that we have a role to play, to build that future, Jim, that you talked about, right? This virus, this opportunity, this thing that has affected all of us, regardless of our race, our religions, our genders, all these sorts of things, hopefully long enough, this pandemic, right? To better understand our relationship with the past and the relationship to the future that we want to build together. So that really resonated with me from the original remarks. And then how to bring these two things together, what Riane is talking about with regard to the partnership model and the 4 cornerstones, and how the U process, I think what was coming up in the chat, and Jim, something you said was this idea of scaling the heart of the human predicament, right? With the cornerstones at the core. And how creating a microcosm of the system could help us actually to begin that journey, as I think, Joseph, you were saying. So lastly, I'll just add one thing, because I'm watching the chat and I'm seeing a lot of people ask, well, how do we get to that deeper place of knowing? And I think we're being offered that opportunity right now through the pandemic to look more deeply within ourselves. And again, to find ways to communicate, not so much verbally, without listening first, without hitting that pause button to really understand and look into the eyes of another person and connect in a way that is human. And maybe from that place, we can start to create those new realities that I've heard everyone talking about this morning. So those are some initial observations. I appreciate the invitation to share. Thanks, Jim.
Well, thank you, Susan. And another time, would love to have you back just to describe your work in India, for example. And I think it would be worth us all having a deeper dive into David Baum and his dialogue process, because I think that is key to activating the synchronicity required for the transformation that we seek. So I just want to note that, and thank you for bringing that in. Now let's hear from Hede. I think he's coming in from Amsterdam today. Hede, welcome. Any comments?
Thank you, Jim. And thank you, Riane and Joe and Susan for your comments and your stories. When I look at my notes that I made during the whole conversation, the dialogue so far, and looking at the comments, one thing stood out for me, which was the word fear that appeared quite a lot on the right side in the comments. Related to the question Riane ended with was, how to make that mind shift, if you like, the global mind shift, in order to actually observe any framework from which we can then start the transformation to more partnership systems. And And I believe that fear is gonna actually be the trigger for people to get on the table and get a seat on the table, if it's safely done. If I look at the examples both Riane and Joe gave of an experience, of an assumed experience of the U curve, and that moment of almost magical flow without words, I think they're both started off with a disruption, a radical disruption, something unexpectedly happening of Riane with the tornado, and with the example Susan gave in our current days, it's the pandemic. So I feel that disruption, and if so, will it be just offered by nature, by itself, in order to invite all of us to go to that deeper observing, and through that, being able to express our fears in a dialogue or bone dialogue environment, so that people feel safe to bring their fears. Because I really think it is necessary to include people from the dominance system, or embedded or framed into the dominant systems, to include them into the transition, the careful transition towards partnership through dialogue.
Yes. A very, very good point. Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Hide. Now, Leslie, any comment you want to make, and then we'll circle back to Joe and Riane.
Well, woo-hoo, Canada just put out its budget yesterday, and the primary centerpiece is $30 billion to childcare.
Wow.
And that is for a population that's 11% of the US. So 11% population in our country compared to the US. And we just put $300 billion into childcare over the next 5 years. And that will bring us in 5 years' time to $10 a day daycare for women, families. I think that's when we start to see the economics that Riane has spoken about. Also, other significant monies towards small business, particularly those owned by Black female entrepreneurs. I think that we are seeing signs, and I think that's what makes it exciting when we see structural change, as in financial budgets, alongside the sociological evolution that we're seeing. So that is due to the work that Riane and Joe and Susan and Hide have been doing, because the quanta field is constantly being informed by this intentionality of how we shift to a new world reality. And so it's really on the shoulders of so many that we get to acknowledge these phenomenal opportunities. Does that mean a home run? Not at all. But what I would also just like to comment in terms of the U in this moment is that we have been in the U since the pandemic began. And those of you in the audience have been inside the U over 230 days. The question is, are you still at the other side of suspending? Or have you allowed yourself to move down into the uncomfortable but most incredible place of the bottom of the U, where we not only are accessing source, but we're shifting beliefs? Or have you allowed the U to unfold for you over the course of these 230 days to crystallize the new opportunities that you see inside of this? One of the things that I really want to comment is that the U work that I've done is the suspending is the most important part, because even thinking, I think we want to get everybody to a partnership model, jumps the U. You're jumping from we're here and we got to get here. The unfolding implicate order of our world right now is unknown. And the more that we keep thinking that it's going to look like this or look like that, we are undermining the potentiality of what we're about to create. So I think we're informed by concepts. I think we're informed by constructs. However, the real beauty of the U is that the reason we go observe, observe, observe is because we observe first from our own experience, next from another level that is uncomfortable to us, and the third with the complete opposite of us. Because only when we hold all those dynamics are we able to truly suspend our sense of knowing. And so when we did, the U through homelessness and the whole notion of how do we embrace it in this very significant, community that was affected by high disparity between rich and poor, we absolutely invited those who had the economic, dominance to be inside of the experience of the homelessness. And so only when they experienced firsthand what it was like, not just that, but that the people who were homeless were as bright, as smart, as competent as they were. They just had a series of unfortunate events that put them into that circumstance. And only when those relationships were built going down the U were we able to open the space for a shift in belief about what really is the social issue here that we're being asked to come into. And my last point is we don't have to worry, because a lot of what we're talking about here is an industrial age notion that we're going from to. That's an industrial construct. We're not going from to, we're coming into and out to in, around this new field of implicate order. So I believe that as we move to this other understanding of diverse, complex ecosystems, we're one, we live in one, we're interacting together, we open the field for the potentiality. And I can tell you that Generation Alpha, which were born after 2013, as much as they're affected by the pandemic, are genetically embedded for this time, as are millennials and others who are coming in. My millennial son is an incredible father, nothing like what his father was or his grandfather. We are producing into this world a species that is new and different and ready for this. So I look at this as it's not to and from, it's not that we have an idea exactly of what the other side of the U looks like. We're in the journey of uncovering what is to become. And the more we suspend our own biases, our own models, our own frames of reference, the more we become open to what is actually there already. The consciousness that we are here to have, it's existing. We just need to download it and do it with people who we trust and with people who can benefit from the journeying through the U. That's it, sorry.
Beautifully put. Thank you, Leslie. I love it that Canada has set a priority for childcare.
Yeah.
That may be a world's first. So well done, Canada. Well done, Canada. Riane, Joe, comments. Riane, what do you make of all this?
What I make of it is this, that, well, first of all, when I first, the Real Wealth of Nations, which introduced the idea of the caring economics of partnerism, came out in 2007. And at that time, just putting caring and economics in the same sentence was beyond the pale. So while I think Leslie is right that we don't know exactly what the future is going to look like, we do need to analyze patterns.
Yes.
Patterns that keep repeating themselves.
Yeah.
And that's where I do think that we are shifting from domination to partnership. What form that will manifest itself, we don't know, but we do know certain underlying principles of the structure of a partnership system. And it is not just working together, because people work together all the time in domination systems, terrorists, cartels, gangs. You know, it really depends on what informs us in terms of our values. So the fact that Canada just did this is fantastic. And yes, but we need an economic system that not only invests in the quote care economy, but that has a caring economy where all policies, whether it's doing away, as Governor Newsom did in California with private prisons as a business. I mean, that just incentivizes construction of more and more business, says more and more prisons, more and more people to fill the prisons, etc. A caring economics goes beyond just the care economy. So I think that it's a very interesting tightrope dance here, because on the one hand we've missed patterns because we were really, as I said, operating our analysis with such an incomplete database, frankly, and thinking that domination, the only two alternatives are you either dominate or you're dominated. Like Trump said, you know, it's all about domination. For him, there is no partnership alternative. But we also need to have enough flexibility, and I really agree with that very much, so that people can come up with their own vision and their own solutions. So I think it's a fascinating time, and I agree that the pandemic, I mean, has really made it possible, as Hida said, you know, it's that disruption that people don't want to go back. Do we really want to go back to a normal where in the United States, in this wealthy nation, 1/4 of all children lived in poverty before the pandemic? Of course not. I mean, we need to build a better normal. And so all kinds of thoughts are coming here. But I want to hear what Joe and Susan, I've been working very closely with Susan on this. How do we create that safe space? And I think it's very interesting that fear, it's a two-edged sword, because fear also puts people in denial and really makes it, well, the data in nurturing our humanity is fascinating. People from these kinds of very rigid domination backgrounds, actually the part of our brain that makes us possible for us to really appropriately respond to changing circumstances is faulty, is less developed, is less effective in these people, because they are so stuck on listening to that voice of authority, that actually the structure of the brain, it doesn't mean that they can't change, but it takes them forever. So there's climate change denial, there's election result denial, there's pandemic denial. How do we harness the fear at the same time to open people up rather than to have them cling to the familiar, which people from these backgrounds will do. They will vote for the strongman leader because it's familiar.
Very well put, Riane. Thank you. Thank you. Joe, Susan, what would be your comments on Riane's question today?
Yeah, so first, I think it's important for us to collectively, after this is over with, determine the best entry point for a U process to affect this kind of global change. We may need a U process to determine that, but just imagine for a moment that you have 30 people representing a microcosm of the system that you want to change, and they have committed to a 6-month leadership lab, which is which is a U-Process lab. The way you begin this is with days and days of awareness training and dialogue training, the sort of thing that Susan was discussing, Bohmian dialogue. And we have seen this time and time again. When people go through this kind of awareness training, which involves significant exposure to nature, to wild nature. These are wilderness solos where dialogues take place soon after 4 nights and 3 days, 4 days and 3 nights of solo time in wild nature. This has a tendency to do 2 things. One, it creates a liminal experience where people begin to resort to their beginner's mind. They begin releasing all of these fixed mindsets. And second, there is an element of compassion that arises in this sort of an experience. And someone on the chat mentioned this, and it's absolutely true, that the power of love is the only thing that can drive out fear. And the principle we have to focus on in these processes is to drive out fear. You're absolutely correct, Riane and Jim and whoever else mentioned it. So to become a true instrument of social change, the people going through this have to experience this beginner's mind, these processes in deep nature, and begin to dialogue the dialogue processes with that sort of a open heart. And that's when this true magic occurs in these U-Process labs.
Thank
Well,
you.
maybe because I live in this beautiful green place, I've been more able to, but I've always been an outsider too. And I think that helped come up with a different perspective. How do we get people to really feel comfortable letting go of, as you said, Joe, of their assumptions? That is the first challenge.
Yes.
I would just like to
let's get from Susan Hetty and then Leslie, just quick comments. But you're asking the right question, Riane. Thank you.
Thank you, Riane. So my quick comment, building from Joseph, and part of why we believe nature is so important, is it links actually to something Leslie said about the U-Process around the homeless, right? So it's that understanding at some point that we actually have so much more in common than differences. And David Bohm would describe that as shared meaning. So he talked about the shared meaning of the group. And the shared meaning of the group in Bohm's perspective was the glue that actually held it together. So that when things went real askew, and they will, there was always a place to come back to. And it's about trust. And I'm not talking about trust from the standpoint of like my mailman and the predictable time. That's the shift. So that's how I would answer the question, Riane.
On that, in that vulnerability, we are invited to express our fears and our opinions and our judgments. It's not aimed at somebody else. It's not with a convincing energy, but from the vulnerability to actually, in the collective, express your fears is a gateway to transforming it to the love that was mentioned earlier. So I think let's not forget that in fears, in judgments and opinions lies a lot of information. Actually, behind all of that is a lot of information. So what we want is to create a safe space for people to express these fears rather than to exclude them. We want to include all of them and express them, because that's where the information lies to get to the next level.
Good. Yes. Yes. All of our emotions are basically carriers of vast information.
Absolutely, yes.
Very well put. Thank you. Thank you. Leslie.
So I think that fear is information. And I think Riane's work is really phenomenal in terms of how it walks through the biology of the mind, the neurology of the mind, and how we are sending chemical messages depending on how we're interfacing with our environment. And I think that what that tells me is that we actually, when we enter with disruption, we're open to something new. And I believe that in a couple of components. I think that when we do a U lab, such as the 30 that Joe's referring to, we have to go with maximum diversity. Because what we tend to do is we tend to want to associate with as many people that think the same that we do, so that we can get to the other side faster. And what my experience is that the highest level of diversity, I mean on all spectrums, in a safe container, and I think this is what's been fundamental in what Joe's been saying, and also Susan and Hide, is that it has to feel safe. And the safety is around learning about myself. So it's not simply about learning about my world, learning about each other. It's I need to become in touch with who I am in this moment, what my fears are in this moment, how I'm being triggered in this moment. And when I'm held in relation with others who are going through that same uncovery, same discovery, we share the journeying of finding ourselves. And as we share the journey of finding ourselves, we become more open to finding the journey of what we're here to do, which is the question that the you will pose. So fear is actually an incredibly important ingredient in the U process. It's how it's introduced, it's how it's worked with, and how it informs, and then how it's reconciled, so that we now know that that trigger can in fact be reprogrammed, as Riane said in her work, and that we've reprogrammed our own fear mechanism. And in the process, we have now created an energetic field for the possibility at the bottom, and then as we come up the U. So it only takes 25% of a population to change a social norm. So let's start with a small percent and just keep bursting that out.
Well, I want to say that we are launching a movement called Make Partnerism Mainstream. And for those of you who are interested in that, please go to the website centerforpartnership.org or partnerism.org.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we've come to the end of our time, unfortunately. So I think I'm just, the appropriate way to end this would be to have Joe and Riane give us just sort of a final comment. Maybe starting with you, Riane, summarize just in a minute or two your reflections from this conversation, this dialogue.
Well, the fact that we're having this dialogue and not being killed for having it, as we would have been just a few hundred years ago, even in the West, that gives us hope, grounded hope. On the other hand, things do get co-opted. And I think it's very important. Somebody wrote in the chat, something important, we get what we focus on. And I would like us to just refocus and look at the whole system, look at what we're learning about historic and cross-cultural patterns, possibilities that, as Leslie said, may manifest in different environments differently, but there are certain central principles. And one of them is a belief system in which caring for people starting at birth and caring for our natural life support systems is guiding us and guides economics. That's what I think we're sort of trying to move toward. And if we can help people have a frame, a worldview that shows that this is not only possible, but is really deeply rooted in millennia of human cultural evolution, I think we can do a lot.
Thank you. Thank you. Joe, final comment.
Our final comment is as follows. Just last week, the National Intelligence Council, which is the group that is the umbrella over the 17 or 18 intelligence units in our government, came out with their report, which is published every 4 years and given to the new administration. The National Intelligence Council group, the NIC, said that the most serious threat facing our country and the world today is social fragmentation. Social fragmentation. So I use this as a way to point to the fact that we may be at a point for the first time that this kind of work can gain traction. And it's an opportunity for us to do what we're talking about today.
Beautiful. Well, that is a powerful note with which to conclude, everyone, that the consensus of the national intelligence agencies of the United States, which probably has the best intelligence of any nation on earth, is concluding that it is social fragmentation.
Yes.
That is the central challenge of the polity. That is means it's not an enemy, it's ourselves. And that's a fundamental recognition. So thank you for bringing that in, Joe. And I would like to just make a couple of concluding comments of my own, if I may, as we conclude. And that is, I'd like to just, I think, Susan, you made a very seminal point when you talked about trust based not on certainty, but on vulnerability. I think that's key to just about everything, because the pandemic has made us all vulnerable. And the fear that comes out of that vulnerability instinctively wants to make us contract. But the deeper message is how we let go into the vulnerability that has been activated in such a way that a new world opens, and we need to trust that process. So I think that notion of vulnerability and trust is something that all of us, because we're all more vulnerable now, can benefit contemplating on, because I think it's an essential part of activating the U process. And then the other comment the next comment I want to make is to take up the point, Joe, that you made about it starts with observe, observe, observe. And what popped up in my mind very quickly was a story about Gorbachev. I had the great privilege of working with Gorbachev for a number of years, and we brought him to the United States shortly after he had resigned as president of the Soviet Union, as the Soviet Union was collapsing. We went to the Council on Foreign Relations. He gave his lecture, and the first question went to the dean of the council, was Henry Kissinger. And we were all expecting Kissinger to give a oration about foreign policy and his opinions about everything. And he stood up and he simply said, "Mr. Gorbachev, why did you fall?" And sat down. And Gorbachev was startled. But he said something I'll never forget, to your point, Joe. He says, I fell in the end because I didn't analyze reality ruthlessly enough. And if there's ever a time in the collective history of humankind when we have to analyze reality ruthlessly enough, it is now. It is now. And at the moment of our fear, as Hede was pointing out, at the moment when we are contracting and finding it the most difficult to let go, we have to trust that vulnerability. And I think, Riane, you have nailed ruthless realism of our present global predicament. I mean, those 4 pillars of yours, if everyone thinks about that for a moment, childhood, gender, economics, and narrative and language, those, if we could crack those codes, we would liberate an energy into the future evolution of humanity and the larger eco-field that would transform this prison we've created for ourselves into a new Garden of Eden. So, Riane, I want to thank you and I want to acknowledge you. And I think, as you pointed out, Leslie, and Riane with Finland, we have examples of where this breakthrough is starting like a dandelion through the concrete to burst through, and what it's going to take. And I want to make my concluding comment back to your story, Joe, of when in the face of that tornado, you rushed out. You were the 3rd person there. And without thinking, you and the people there went into a flow, a synchronicity of intent that allowed the creative, redemptive work that you were doing to just happen. And so that the connection between intent, between purpose, is key all the way through the you. And part of what we're wanting to cultivate with Humanity Rising is that vulnerability of trust, that rigorous, ruthless realism that Riane is bringing in, and then the synchronicity that happens when there's a clear intent and an openness of initially a suspension of belief, a cognitive suspension of what I know to be true that allows a deeper truth to move in and through us and to recreate us like a potter reworking wet clay. And this is the reason we wanted to have Joe and Riane back, because I believe, as someone who's convened every single one of the 230 sessions of Humanity Rising to this day, when the jury is deliberating in Minneapolis, that there is something very profound, in my view, when what Riane is talking about in the spirit of ruthless realism, with a call to an extraordinarily abundant and regenerative future, if we just shift from a dominator model to a partnership model, then if you bring in the you process, just think of what that could catalyze. So we want to pursue this, everyone. We want to take this further. And the discussion, as Joe articulated, is to now broaden this, and over the next months to bring together a larger group that would really focus on what Riane is challenging us to take seriously as the gateway, and then apply the you process as a catalytic instrument into leading people into a higher illumination of what is not only true, but what can be. That's why Humanity Rising is here. That's what we're designed for. And I know Joe and Susan and Hide and Leslie, as you've been working with the U process, you folks are similarly aligned. So we'll have to leave it at that today because of the constraints of time. But I want to thank you all for an extraordinary, a seminal conversation, because I think we've now set the foundation for a deeper dive into what could arguably be the most important conversation that we can have in the world right now. And that is, how do we change consciousness at a mass level when we all know we have a diminishing framework of time within which to do so? That is what we need to now do. So thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. This has been brilliant. I am thrilled with every cell in my body and can hardly wait for next steps. So thank you, everyone. We'll see you again here tomorrow. Tomorrow is the 21st of April, and then it's the 22nd of April. So we're going to be focusing on Earth Day. What a moment to be celebrating our precious Earth that we've so devastated and yet nurtures us with every breath that we take. That'll be Earth Day starting tomorrow on Humanity Rising. And we'll circle back in due course about the next actions for when partnership meets the U process. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you here again tomorrow on Humanity Rising. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Bye, and thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Well, I must say, Jim, you are so inspired and inspiring. It's lovely. And I look forward to what we do with this.